Welcome everybody. Welcome everybody to this session of the Research Data Architectures for Research Institutions mouthful of an interest group. Thank you very much for joining us. It's currently 7 AM where I am in the UK at the moment, so I'm a little bit sleepy still, but I shall try and go through things okay, but forgive me if I seem a little bit sluggish this morning. So this session is going to be about interoperability in a fairly broad sense. We're looking at the challenges facing interoperability within research institutions, so I'll come back to talk about that. I'll give a very brief kind of scene setting talk where I just introduce what our diary does. It might not actually be 5 minutes. I'm then going to talk myself a little bit about the situation at UCL, where I work, and about our attempts to design an interoperable infrastructure. Spoiler alert, it's not terribly interoperable just yet. We'll then be hearing from the University of Cape Town. Kimmy's just joined us. And then the bulk of this meeting will really be taken up by hopefully a rich and interesting discussion on some of the drivers and challenges the institutions face when trying to provide interoperability. Keith will be introducing the conversation, but I'm hoping that we can get a really good conversation going and maybe come up with ideas which are worth taking forward and which we can explore a little more in a bit more depth in future sessions. And finally, I'll try and wrap things up and talk about those next steps and give my usual plea to have more people joining the group, especially as co-chairs, because there's just the two of us at the moment. So start thinking already if you might be interested in being a co-chair of the session. We do all sorts of interesting things. Oops, where's my next slide? So yeah, so our diary is basically, this is our kind of blurb if you're new to the group, or if you could do with a reminder. So we're primarily concerned with technical architectures for managing research data within universities and other multidisciplinary research institutions. Although in truth, we're not purely technical. We do talk about the sort of organizational challenges, bringing the right people in, and so forth. We provide insight into the approaches being taken to the development and operation of such architectures and their success or otherwise in enabling good practice. So that's basically the idea. We've explored all sorts of things in recent memory. So we've had sessions on things like electronic research notebooks. We did a few years ago, we did a large sort of global survey of universities and other research institutions and what kind of services they actually offer, to see what the state of the art was and help put people in touch with each other. This in some ways is a bit of a getting back to our roots kind of session, and we are looking very specifically at the kind of architectural aspects of things. And I should also say that although we focus on multidisciplinary institutions, please don't flee if you happen to be someone who works very much within a particular research domain, because it's very useful, I think, to try and learn lessons from people who are working in a particular domain, or even at institutions that are focused on one or just a handful of different domains. There are slightly different challenges, obviously, when you look at different types of institution, but there's a lot to learn, I think, from more focused institutions. So please do stay with us and do join the conversation. And I think on that note, I will switch to my my own situation at UCL slides and explain a little bit about what we're doing, what's going on, and what's not going on that we would like to have going on. So my name's James Wilson. I'm the head of research data at UCL. We used to be part of the overarching information services division. I now belong to a strange kind of small hybrid group called Advanced Research Computing that engages in both original research and in providing services to our academic researchers. I am in charge of a number of different elements of research data infrastructure, but I'm not in charge of everything that goes on at UCL by a long shot. It's a very large university, and there are different teams who are involved in the kind of data management challenges. Traditionally, I did data storage and looked after the technical aspects of data repository, but I've now somehow managed to also end up responsible for our research information management systems as well. So it gets ever more confusing trying to bring all these things together. So this is a highly idealized research data lifecycle model, and I'm sure a lot of you here before have seen things like this before. What we've tried to do is look at the different aspects of it and actually break out what services and tools we have that can help people at each of these kind of steps and stages. And whilst it might be a little bit hard to see the details, hopefully you can see that some of the things we put here are in green, and these are the tools and services that we control and have some influence over at an institutional level. And then we have lots of things that are in black, which are tools that people use, but we don't really have much control over. So perhaps the first thing to note is that it's a very rich and complex landscape, and we as an institution don't control everything. So there are limits to what we can do. But I will just rattle around the life cycle. So at the planning phase there, you can see that we use, well, you probably can't see unless you've got very good eyesight, that we use DMP online, which I suspect probably other institutions use as well. It's close relative to DMP tool, which tends to be more popular in North America. For funding bids, we use software called WorkTribe to help with the pre and post award systems. The data collection, obviously, this is the area where we have least control over what our researchers do, because we cover every discipline under the sun. There's all sorts of ways that people generate data, store it, analyze it, and so forth. We have recently adopted RSpace as an electronic lab, electronic research notebook system, which we hope will give us a little bit of a view of actually how our researchers are working, how they're conducting their experiments, how they're managing their data, how they're processing it. Moving on to data storage, we have a number of institutional solutions. Ideally, researchers should be using the research data storage service, which I manage, or our data safe haven if they're working with sensitive data, particularly if it's got personally identifiable information, which I don't manage. It's a different team that deals with that, just to add to the complications. We have various high performance computing facilities to assist at the data analysis stage. When it comes to depositing data, we have ePrints, which we use for sort of written textual outputs, and we use Figshare for data outputs. Again, I suspect those names might be familiar to a number of people here. We don't really have a long-term data preservation system in place yet. We're working on that. And what you can see here, the slightly odd curtailed circle to the left of the diagram, is my first attempt at kind of mapping on an information management life cycle to this. So this is the kind of information about outputs and publications, which are very important, particularly in the UK, for getting universities funding. So we need to prove every 7 years in the UK that our researchers are producing enough world-class research that the government gives us lots of money. So there are a few new tools on here. We use a version of symplectic elements to manage and track the outputs. We use a homegrown tool called Iris, which is falling apart at the seams, to manage our researcher profiles. And then we have to kind of integrate these things with the national tools that people need to use to report stuff. So it's a complicated landscape. Some of those technologies might be familiar, some of them are homegrown. It's a whole variety of different things. Oops. So interoperability. First element of interoperability, and perhaps the most important that I'm going to mention, is the metadata. So we want to capture the metadata. We do capture metadata using all of these kind of tools around all the different parts of the research lifecycle. But some of our systems basically capture project-based metadata. So when people apply for funding, the metadata we get is all at the project level. When people store their data in the research data storage service, we capture metadata at the project level. Researchers can add their own metadata for different data sets and so forth, but in practice, most don't. They have so much data, they just dump it in, and they might structure it in the usual folder structures, but they don't necessarily have user-defined data at that level. Other systems that we have do record metadata at the dataset level, in particular, of course, Figshare, where people generally upload one or several files that work closely together and then provide that kind of more detailed metadata. During the actual process, we have no control really over what metadata our researchers capture. It's whatever is useful to them. They don't necessarily think about whatever is going to be useful to other researchers, unless they're in an academic field where that's become the kind of the norm to do so. Pretty much none of our systems that we currently use follow any kind of recognized metadata standards. So Figshare uses a kind of a pared down version of the DataSite metadata. But even its kind of stablemate symplectic elements, both Figshare and symplectic elements are owned by DataScience. They don't actually capture exactly the same metadata fields. So if you want to bring metadata over from Figshare, you have to do a crosswalk. There's literally none of our systems which capture the same metadata. So this makes it more challenging. There's good reason why they all use different metadata, but it does make it challenging when you're trying to provide interoperability. We have had a stab at integrating some of our services. So our homegrown research data storage service, for starters, it pulls information from our HR systems when you go and set up a project. So you can add various people, you start typing their names, it will pull it from the HR database. Great, we can kind of associate who's in a particular research project with who's in our HR database. Excellent. We've also added a feature recently so people can add external collaborators, because obviously that's becoming increasingly important in this day and age. So you can add external collaborators. Now we have a separate Microsoft Azure AD group where external collaborators are managed, so we can see who's accessing systems from outside the university. We've also done some development work against the Figshare API so that you can click this blue button, which you won't be able to see because it's far too small. But what that will do is effectively recreate projects that are set up in our research data storage service in Figshare. So this last screen down there at the end of this chain is actually a screenshot, not the most interesting screenshot from Figshare, but it is a screenshot from Figshare, which shows projects that have actually been created in the RDSS being represented in Figshare, although there is, of course, that difference so that we get the metadata at project level, but not necessarily item level. So there's still manual things for the researchers to do. Now, this is great. We were pleased that we managed to do this integration. It took a little bit of work, but it works. It works okay. So far, the number of researchers that we know who've actually made use of this is minimal, because frankly, it's a bit hard to do this and make it entirely intuitive. And most people aren't really, most of our researchers aren't necessarily thinking in the way that we like to think, in terms of this kind of joined up life cycle. For them, these are a number of different systems, and they just don't really, the idea that you might publish from one into another is still a bit of a novelty, I think, for a lot of people. So they might well store their data in the RDSS, but when it comes to publishing the data, they will add their files independent of the RDSS into Figshare. And in some ways that's simpler because they just add the item metadata and they don't go through Figshare's project system, which isn't so well known. So we've done this work, it works, it's brilliant, but it's not being used as much as we would like. So it's not really achieving the kind of goals we set ourselves. Now, as well as working in our own world of research, we have institutional architects, and sometimes they're helpful and sometimes they're frustrating, but they try and apply their own set of architectural principles to the work we do. To be honest, more often than not, it's a bit frustrating. But what they don't like is the kind of integration that I just illustrated, and with good reason. So point-to-point integrations come with problems. They're hard to maintain. You need to maintain it all yourself. If vendors change the systems they're using, it can easily break things. There's a lot of emphasis on the university to publicize how these integrations work, to actually get people to use them and know that they're there. And this poses us challenges. What our architects, what our sort of institutional architecture team would like is for us to use a single vendor, because they see that as solving all the problems. If we have just one vendor, they are by definition interoperable, even though we know that's actually not the case, because one vendor can have different tools which aren't all that interoperable. So all we really need is one vendor that can do all of that, and that's our problem solved. Now, I'm not convinced that even if there was one vendor that could do all of that, it would actually necessarily solve all our problems. I think we'd have all sorts of issues with lock-in and various other things, but that would be one solution. They also like the idea of data lakes, data warehouses, using extract, transform, and load principles. And if you're not familiar with ETL, basically the idea is you take data from all of your individual services, you move the data to a single system, cleaning it up as you do so, which can then represent that data with a kind of unified set of metadata or some other system. So you can sort of interrogate everything at once. Now, our architects come very much from the perspective of how to run an institution well. So what they're interested in is data that enables people to make good management decisions. That's not, of course, what we're aiming to do here. So there is a slight different perspective, which I'm not sure they necessarily always see. And even then, their ETL systems that they have put in place for sort of enterprise data haven't necessarily worked all that well. As I understand, it's currently switched off because the whole thing broke. So it's still a very challenging thing, even if you are going to do this kind of thing. And I'm not really sure how you could apply it to something like the research data lifecycle, but perhaps there's something to explore there. And this perhaps brings me on to my last slide. It does bring me on to my last slide, which is when we think about our interoperability, I suspect that it's a good idea to step back a little bit and think what it is, what the problems are we're trying to fix. So we're not really looking here for management data that will enable us to run our university more efficiently. What we're looking for here, to my mind, is to be able to improve the way that research, improve the reproducibility of research, improve the people's ability to replicate research and support it. And in particular, and this is obviously one of the major themes of RDA, is to be able to enable this confident reuse of data. What we're looking at is a whole kind of fair data, open science principles that will enable data to go further and will improve, not just improve life for researchers, but improve research. So we have multiple stakeholders. We're not just looking after our own researchers. We're also trying to make sure that they can easily meet funder requirements about data reuse, add value, and ultimately enable them to do new and interesting things with research data that wouldn't be possible before, recombining data, doing all of those kind of things. So that's the way I look at what it is that we're trying to do all this for. And I should point out, my final point, I've kind of mentioned at the beginning, that some disciplines have tackled problems at a disciplinary level and on the whole done a pretty good job of it. A lot of disciplines haven't really started along that pathway. And of course, if you are a multidisciplinary institution such as UCL, you kind of have to help everyone. So it's been possible for us to maintain tools in every single discipline, which were entirely disciplinary focused. So we have to do a little bit of generalization to kind of help catch people in non-traditional disciplines. So for instance, we describe our repository, our data repository, as a bit of a repository of last resort. So we actually, last resort. So we encourage our researchers to go off and use disciplinary data repositories where they have that. We're there to kind of try and catch everyone else and make sure that people don't fall the cracks and everyone can do their bit to enable the reuse of data. So maybe that's a slight difference as well. On that note, I think I'm going up well over time. So I will stop talking. We are going to have a big conversation about some of the issues I'm trying to raise here. So maybe, I don't know, Keith, if you've got time for a question or two before we turn to Kimmy, but I think if we just keep questions to clarifications rather than starting a wider debate at the moment, because that's all to come.
Yep, thanks, James. Yes, indeed. The idea was to have two short presentations, just some quick questions for clarification, and then we'll have some discussion about some of the points that that James raised and that Kimmy will also be raising. So are there any urgent questions for clarification? And I'm sorry, I can't see everybody, so if you could raise your hand or speak up or put it in the chat. Steve Quinnett. Yes, go ahead, Steve.
Thanks, James. Actually, that's brilliant. Actually, I realise it probably feels vulnerable or something, but I think it's brilliant. I think all the points you've raised. I've got a quick question, just a clarification, just around the magic button that transfers data. Sorry, my video's off. Transfers data from RDSS to Figshare. Does that copy data, or is it just the metadata?
It does copy the data, so it does actually, we can actually create items in Figshare, but of course from the researcher's point of view, it doesn't necessarily save them that much time because they still have to enter the individual fields. So what it does, essentially, it opens up a kind of file browser from within our research data storage service, which is kind of a GPF-based system that we use, and enables people to select files and then kind of replicates just the key elements of the Figshare form. So the description, it can automatically generate the authors, so it assumes that the depositor is the author, and then they can just click on other people in a project. So the people we bring in from the HR database. So that will all be transferred across into Figshare. It's very useful actually for people with large files because it avoids the uploading files through a browser issue. So it does have a kind of a unique role to play in that respect, but it's just getting people aware of its existence. It's a bit of a challenge.
Mm-hmm. I'll ask a follow-up question in the later on. Thanks.
Thanks, Steve. Bertrand?
Hi, sorry, my name is Emma. That's my last name.
Oh, okay, sorry, Emma. Thank you.
Thank you for your presentation, James. So I took a screenshot of the very complex information lifecycle you presented. Are you expecting to expand this collaboration between HR and Figshare to other repositories? And how are you envisioning that working out given the different formats in which the data will come in and the different size requirements?
In terms of data repositories, not really, because the approach we're taking, for right or wrong, is that we focus initially on those services that we have some control over. So Figshare is the institutional data repository. We have a certain amount of control over it. Figshare for institutions. If we were trying to do that for data repositories that we don't have control over, I think it'd be even more complicated to try and tie things together. I mean, maybe that's something that's worth thinking about later, about how institutions can go about joining things up in the wider ecosystem of research data management, but it's not something we've tackled or intending to tackle in the next few years. We've got other more pressing things to do first. But yes, it would be lovely if we could do that with other repositories, particularly subject specific ones.
Sure, that's reasonable. Now, as a follow-up, Figshare just introduced something called Figshare Plus for particularly large data sets, but you do have to charge the user. Do you have a special collaboration to avoid having to charge the user every time they want to upload a particularly large data set?
No, so we're not. In fact, this is new to me. You can tell that I've been busy trying to integrate all our research information apps recently, so I've missed this Figshare Plus thing. And because we can kind of do that anyway, we're quite hands-on in terms of the service on top of Figshare and the other things we offer to our users. So we will happily go and help them do things like large file uploads ourselves. So it's not something we've hit yet.
Okay, well, thank you.
Okay, thank you. I'd like to now move on to Kimmy. So James, if you can stop sharing your screen, please.
Oh, sorry, I thought I'd already stopped sharing it.
No, it's still there. So a big thank you to Kimmy for coming in, and Kimmy's from the University of Cape Town, and they've done a large project on bringing together their data systems. So Kimmy's here to present on what they've achieved there, and especially also which challenges they've run into in that process. So without any further ado, I hope Kimmy, yep, there we go. That's looking good. Yep, great. Okay. And it's there. Thank you.
Good morning, everyone. It's about 9:30 in the morning here in South Africa. I'm Kimmy Keith. I'm from the IT department, the systems division. Interestingly, I just came from the research office in 2019. So I was part of this project in two capacities, but both with research hat on. And Renata May is from UCT Research, and this is her presentation. So hopefully I'll do it justice. Okay, so with our project, these were the aims that we started with. It was around 2017 when the University of Cape Town recognized the need to address a number of issues relating to the systems that support the research lifecycle. And there were things that came out. These were project aims, the strategies, policies, and processes that went into our decision-making process, we had a research administration system, ERA. It's actually based on the Converus platform, but we call it ERA, Electronic Research Administration. We were going to look at and see how DMP online would work with that. And then with the outputs Figshare and Open UCT on that side, looking at data analytics and things that were coming out of there for the rankings, as well as statutory reporting. In South Africa, we have to report on research outputs for subsidy, and it's quite a large income generation activity at the university. And then if you look at the bottom in these hexagons, we were looking at DHET, which is where we submit our publications to, the NRF, at our other partners and funders that brought into this whole cycle. So those are the broad aims that we started with. And from an architecture, well, from a scope perspective, these were the kinds of systems when we were looking at UCT that we'd have to deal with. So this is taking it one step further. If you look at the top, these 3 database structures here, those are basically person data. We have third parties at the university. We have our staff members with SAP HR. We have Oracle PeopleSoft that actually has our student data. And this was brought into business objects, and that's where all our staff profiles or student profiles were added. These are the source systems. It's very important as we look at all the systems and how they connect, is to identify where the source is and obviously not recreate data that should be in a source somewhere else. So this is quite important. As I spoke about before, in the square in the middle, ERA Converus is our research administration system. And we report then to the Department of Higher Education and Training, which is up at the top right, via journals, chapters and books, and conference proceedings, papers. And there's a few things in here that Converus does. It's the researcher profile, it's publications, the award process, pre-awards, awards, post-awards, basically searching for funding, getting the funding, and then reporting on it, and a few other things. But the submission is for the publications mainly. And then you can see how the other items connect to it. I'm not going to go into too much detail into the slide because there's a more comprehensive one after the project, but you can see the DMP roadmap that we want to connect. We've got Sherpa Romeo. There were ethics applications. This was manual at the time. I'll touch on that exciting news a little bit later. We have Figshare, Open UCT, and that's where all our open publications come through. And then the external tools are just listed here for pretty much for information and how they connect then to Figshare. So if we go to the next slide, this is the architecture that we originally started with, and we wanted to reproduce something like this, but in a UCT context. So we'd have the HR system, that's when our data comes through, the CRIS, which is the current research information system that is actually Converus at UCT. There's DSpace, which we call Open UCT, Archivum, and yeah, so various systems. So this is kind of what we took, and we said, look, we're going to base what we build on this infrastructure and take it forward in that way. So the key challenges that we had was the RDM policy implies an administrative burden. So everything that's added on means somebody needs to do this. There's duplicate capture already across the systems because our systems aren't integrated yet. There's fragmented research outputs. Perhaps academics would have things that were on websites or other systems that they used to, but not on the main one where we had to report to DHET. There was restricted statutory reporting. That means we have to report in a certain way for certain outputs. There's accountability for DMP commitments that came in, so there's policies and things that we had to implement that people maybe did not like. They're monitoring compliance with funder requirements, which is very difficult with the data restrictions and having to comply. And if you can't prove that you're complying, you might also lose funding. There was also the cost UCT libraries of mining the affiliated publications from the web. So that was also an additional cost. The publications themselves are not in the CRIS system. They're actually the metadata of the publication. So to actually get the open publications in was also very challenging. The risks that were identified was there were recommendations for mandatory DMP and ORCID, which was a bit of scope creep because it wasn't something that was looked in right from the beginning. There was difficulty in aligning with the project schedule. So that whole Converus CRIS system I was talking about, that was in an active, I was key in that project. That was actively rolling out at the same time as this project. So there would be different goals at the same time. And sometimes people were busy with other things when they should be doing stuff in the other projects. That was difficult. The vendor integration assistance was sometimes limited. We were also dealing with quite a few different vendors, and the vendor will say, yes, our system does integrate with X system. But when you actually get to it, there's a lot of fine detail that's not in the documentation, or maybe your university does things slightly differently. And the vendor said, well, it's not standard, so we can't really assist you with that. And a lot of research had to go into how to do that. Then there was a proliferation of research systems across. There was a burden at the IT department. There was also a lot of different systems, so that made things very complicated. And there were also system upgrades during the project. So this is what we were mainly to do in working group 1, was mapping the business processes, investigating and identifying the identifiers, unique identifiers, looking at the authentication mechanisms, and developing an architectural strategy. So that was the first of 4 working groups on what they needed to do. And out of that came this project lifecycle that we developed from step 1 initiation to 2 planning to 3 execution to 4 closure. And if you look at the left-hand side, you can see the processes and the systems involved in this life cycle in different colors. So very core was the ERA system, the red one, which we tried to make a one-stop shop. And as was previously mentioned in the previous presentation, we wanted researchers to come to one place and be able to launch all the other systems from there, instead of knowing, okay, for this system, I need to do this, for this system, I need to do that. So we had the same challenge. We wanted to make the one system, which covered most of the areas, the launch pad into all the others, and that was the ERA system. So in the interest of time, I'm just going to go to the next slide, but if you have any questions around this, I'm very happy to talk about it, because this was one of the main outputs of the working group 1. And as you can see in the middle was a project ID, so you'd have the whole life cycle of a project with an ID, and then to give the researchers an understanding of how everything would click together in their minds for their project. The working group 2 was to enable the systems integration. So there was different, this was based on Scolex framework. So for the interlinking service and how they wanted to populate all the different data between different systems. There were some issues with the working group 2 of the arrows where things weren't exactly completed, but there was, as you can see, the integration with the Scolex framework. There was an issue with the open air brokering with the Ziva Hub, integration of the CRIS system that isn't actually available in open air. I checked last night just to double check that it's still not there. It says future release. And then the integration with OpenUCT and ERA, that's also not completed because of the differences and nuances between the systems and what stages they need to be. But the single sign-on was completed, and that really helps with the one-stop shop, because if you sign on to any UCP system, then the other ones you're automatically signed into. So that really is a big enabler. And then with the working group 3, it was mainly looking at the DMP. They managed to put single sign-on on the DMP. And if you look at the bottom, the next step there was to integrate the DMP with the ERA ethics module. And that's where we're currently sitting. Sorry to go back, but if you go back to our nice, you can see that ethics is not in this picture yet. So what we're doing now in the ERA system is putting in the ethics module, and then we'll be able to link all the steps where ethics comes into play in the project lifecycle. So that's the exciting news that we're working on. So obviously in that process, we'll be connecting to the DMP as well. Okay. And then working group 4 was mainly communications and marketing. They're the ones that actually made the infographics look so very nice. There were guidelines, there were videos, there were tools, little booklets and things that the researchers could use. It's very important that researchers know what they can get out of the system. And then this is really the meat of the presentation, was the key challenges to the integration. So we needed to report to the Department of Higher Education and Training, and it has to normally be in a certain format, and it needed to be automated as well. So there are difficulties around this. There are certain ways that you need to do things. For example, your journals have to have certain numbers, and if they don't, you don't get the actual subsidy for them. So we had issues with Sherpa Romeo giving slightly different numbers, and we had to switch it off at some stage because it didn't align to how we needed to report to DHET. There were infrastructure provided that they were slow to respond for the need to interoperability. So we were going at a really fast pace. We found that, you know, in a lot of other areas, these were new things. So we had to wait sometimes for certain providers and to get information and where they were. That was really quite difficult. The research engagement and adoption was really, and this also came out the previous presentation, so I was really lucky or happy to see that, was there's a very slow rate of adoption, even for ORCID, just to adopt that for the researchers. The key there is that people are thinking, what's in it for me? And if you're giving them an option that seems like more of an administrative burden than to help them with their research, then they're very, they really don't really want to do it. So not only the systems, but also just getting an ORCID or anything that they can't see that will help them immediately. The technical issues were also difficult. Just getting single sign-on across all the 4 systems. The ERA already had it, but to get the other ones on were quite difficult, because it was, as you said, all the different vendors had different ways of doing things. The e-research function at the universities to coordinate across support services. And that's difficult because you're dealing with different faculties and departments. Also ask, you know, who are you? And they want to know how you fit into what they're doing, especially with the researchers. If you are helping them with the research, that's great. But if it's as a lot of these things tend to seem administrative burden, then it is difficult. So that's pretty much it from our side. I would like to just end up on the diagram again, because it sums up really very well what we were planning to do, how we wanted everything to be connected to everything. And we are using this as a platform now to, for example, add ethics and to expand interoperability, keeping that ERA, the CRIS system, as sort of the one-stop shop for researchers, trying to make things more beneficial than an administrative burden. Thank you.
Thank you, Kimmy. That was really interesting and very, and also really nice, interesting view next to UCL and how things were done at Cape Town and how things were done at UCL and some of those similarities. So first of all, I think there's room for questions for clarification and just questions related specifically to Kimi's presentation. And we already have one of those in the chat. So Antonia asked about what does the project ID look like? And she's thinking about whether an ORCID ID would be sufficient for this use case, or and that would maybe bring a push to the adoption rate, maybe. So Kimi, what was the project ID? What did you use for that?
Well, that's the thing. We're still working on the project ID. There are different IDs in our core system. So the Converus Electronic Research Administration system is using different IDs for different modules. So they'll have a pre-award ID, a contract ID, post-awards ID, and that's causing a huge amount of confusion, because if you're given an ID and you want to look something up in a system, then you kind of want to be able to find what you're looking for. You don't really care if it's the project ID, whatever ID it is, you just have that one ID. So we are looking at taking all the different modules and making another entity that's called it might be called a project or a study, because sometimes studies have more than one project, and to give one ID to that. But when it comes to RAID, for example, we are looking at connecting more project IDs. The one we're looking at now is to get the organization IDs into the systems. That's where we're actively working in the CRIS system. We will start there, and then we will look at looking at the other ones. So that's grid or raw that we'll be using there, and we're going to expand the different kinds of IDs. So in the ERA, for example, we already have ORCID on the researcher profiles, but it's not mandatory and not everybody puts that in. To make things difficult, you also have to give permission so that you can share tokens between the systems, so that's difficult. So we are inching away for the different identifiers, but that project ID, you're right, it's going to be key. It needs to tie everything together so people can find what they're looking for.
Yeah, and I see in the chat Phil's mentioned RAIDs, and it sounds like you've also looked at RAIDs. So research activity IDs. Did you find them useful, or was that not really useful for your purpose?
Well, we haven't looked extensively at every single one. We're trying to chip away at them one at a time. For us, we really do need to make that connection in the system before we can connect to the identifier. So to build the project or study entity and to connect everything within our system is the first step. And then to look at all the identifiers and how we can share that is sort of a second step. Right now, not a lot of people give priority to something that they can't tangibly get something out. So when we say we want to make another entity in the system, tie everything together, it's not as exciting as saying we're going to automate ethics approvals. So to get the funding and the timing around that is tricky.
Okay, thanks, Kimi. And that's actually an interesting point. We'll come back. I'm sure that will come back when we start talking about drivers. First of all, any other questions for Kimi on her presentation and things happening at Cape Town? Okay, great. In that case, so there's also a few comments here in the chat which are more general about steps in the process and things that we'd like to, that probably need to be taken into account when thinking about integration. I'd like to park those for a second, and I would like to first move to the next step, and that's sort of having a general discussion about what does it mean to build data interoperability within your research institution. So to kick off that discussion, there is in the collaborative notes document, first of all, at the top there's just the usual table with asking you if you'd like to fill in your name, affiliation, and if you want to, your email address, and we can provide slides and things like that after the after this event. Under that table, there's another table, and the first table that's there is about what you see as key drivers for improving data interoperability within your institution. So before we start talking about the challenges, I want to take one step back, and I think James raised a very important question there, and he raised that consideration. Well, it's all very well to want interoperability at the institution, but what are you actually trying to achieve? What is important to your institution? Because that will also define where you put your priorities and where. Ask you all if you could please take a moment and add in that table just add rows in with what you see for your institution as key drivers for improving that data interoperability. If you see somebody that has already put something in there that you agree with, then you can just put +1 behind that.
Keith, it's Steve again.
Yes, Steve, go ahead.
By data interoperability, are you referring to I guess it's the metadata interoperability and passing around? Is that what you really mean?
Yes, I think in the case of both of these presentations, and for a lot of people here in the room, I think the primary focus is metadata interoperability about the data sets.
Yeah.
Okay, so so I'm seeing a few points here about compliance with funder mandates or meeting the requirements of research funders. Also seeing a lot of +1s for improvement of internal workflows, reducing duplication of work and effort, enhance traceability and reproducibility of data, better data management practices with an emphasis on standards for metadata. So Kimmy, if you look at this list, what would you say were key drivers for UCT?
See, people are still writing.
Yep.
Yeah. I think communication, the second one, to be honest, because without the communication, people can't really see. They don't really know why they should even get started with any of this. So the standards, the workshops, the talks, are very, very important. from an adoption point of view, because you can do all of this and then not get anyone to adopt it. But then underneath that, the improvement of internal workflows, that on a technical side is really important, because that's the backbone of what you should be doing. And if you can communicate that you're going to reduce the duplication of work for people, then they can see that that's an advantage. So those two really do stand out for me quite a bit. The others make sense to this group, but if you're looking at it from an outsider or a researcher perspective, they really just want to know what's in it for them. And you can do all the other things so very well, but if you don't have that, then it's not as useful.
And James, for your project, what would you say were the key drivers for?
Yeah, I think it's an interesting one, because obviously, working for a university, it's quite important for the university to save money where they can and to make money where they can. But personally, that's not what really gets me out of bed in the morning. For me, I think it's that ability to ensure that you've got data at the end of the day that can be reused in novel and interesting ways. And I love hearing stories about how people have taken data and done something different with them to find something out. So there's kind of two different mechanisms. There's my job is to ensure that we're not wasting money, we're not losing opportunities to bring in funding and so forth. So from an employer's perspective, that's the kind of the rationale. But personally, there are other things that you can do. So I have slight some dual motivation.
Okay, yeah, thanks. So just looking at this, it looks like the better data management practices with an emphasis on standards for data and metadata is really coming out on top as key drivers, but closely followed by improvement of those internal workflows. And a lot of that is about duplication of work and effort. And I think I saw a lot of that in both James's and Kimmy's presentations. Okay, I would now like to move on to the next question. And that's a question that both Kimmy and James addressed in their presentation. And that's really the key question for today. And that's around the key challenges for improving data interoperability. So if you embark on a project like this and you do choose to improve, you do choose to address those drivers that exist within the institution, what are the challenges? What are the things that are getting in the way? And so I see some people have already started adding ideas here. So I see proprietary systems, insufficient capacity. Okay, we'll keep adding, please. One of these raises a question for me, and that's I think it's the fourth row, the third one, and that's culture, and that's both the different disciplinary cultures as well as organizational culture around data management and sharing. So I understand that, of course, there's differences in disciplinary culture in different disciplines. I was intrigued that comment around organizational culture around data management and sharing. Does anybody like to speak to that?
I would maybe just like to add that that's a really big issue, because, for example, our university works a lot in silos, either in departments or project groups. And when you come at them for anything else that's not in a direct goal that they have, it's not given a priority. So if you have a culture like that, where you don't share, because I think people are very busy and you're under-resourced, and sharing is seen as an additional burden again, and something that they can't see the direct benefit from, then that does affect the data sharing for sure. And also the idea that what are you going to do with my data? Is it going to be safe, etc.? Or are you going to be publishing before me or doing something else? That's secondary. But firstly, I think the general culture, and I'm not sure about other institutions, is that they're quite siloed and focused on specific projects and not necessarily on a holistic picture for the institution.
Thanks, Kimmy. Lisa, I think you've raised your hand.
Yeah, if I may add, I'm the one who wrote the challenge there, and Kimmy already actually started very much getting at the point that I wanted to raise with it. The only thing I would want to add is that you know, because in my organization, exactly those silos, and obviously then that also impacts priority setting. So if you then go and start talking about infrastructure needs, or you know, need to bring together a working group or something like that, organizational level, to work at interoperability issues, if it's not seen as a priority, then it's very hard to get attention and to get resources. And they don't even have to be monetary resources. They can just be, you know, people's attention and time type of resources on this issue. So that's where I see the organizational culture actually as a fundamental to even starting, you know, thinking and talking about those issues, and you may have, you know, the drivers of funders, requirements, which are in our case also a key driver. But then, you know, there's a lot of focus on compliance, making sure that we, you know, check boxes on a piece of paper perhaps, but you know, to go really beyond that, and something more fundamental, culture needs to be supportive of that.
Yeah. Emma?
And just a comment about the point you highlighted about culture. I also, in my personal experience, also find that if you have disciplines that are already used to sharing data, like the geosciences and environmental sciences have a long history of sharing data through the USGS, IOADP, and so on, they're also very unwilling to adopt a different system or to pool all the data into a new repository, because they think, well, if this is working already, why would I change anything? Even though they might be behind the idea of data sharing, they just, I can understand, it's human. Like, if it ain't broke, don't fix it. But
Yep. Hossan?
Yeah, like I'm coming from a different perspective. So like I'm working for a private university. So like most of the people here are researchers in business economics, and the discipline is a bit kind of, yeah, not all of them are very open into open science and research data sharing and so on. So like it adds a level of complexity as well. So like when you try to convince somebody, like you need to share your data for your own benefit somehow, or you need to share your data, or you need even internally within the institute. So like the problem sometimes in some work environments, it is a bit, there is challenges to do this, even within, if people are working within silos or within team groups, which is closed, we sense somehow we have a bit more challenge than the open institutions and so on. And this is something we are trying to work on and try to charge people or try to encourage them to do it and to show the benefit, but like, yeah, it's still a very long way.
Yeah, thanks, Hossam. Phil, I noticed you put quite a few comments in the chat, and one of the later comments is about the tension between what the institution wants the researcher to do and what the researcher wants to do. Would you like to speak to that?
Yes, well, I guess just by way of sort of setting that up, I mean, I am not at an institution. I don't work at an institution. I'm actually a consultant. So just to let everybody know that that's the position I'm coming from. But in a former life, I used to be an academic researcher. And one of the things that is true to greater or lesser degrees, depending on what part of the world you're in and the culture of the institution, is that institutions don't necessarily always have direct control over what researchers particularly are doing. So it's not like a regular organization where you go to work and you have a boss and your boss tells you what to do. And if you don't do what your boss tells you to do, you get into trouble. Instead, researchers are in some degree, in some way, almost like little independent contractors, little independent business people who are doing a job of work, and their task, they see their KPIs, if you like, as being able to bring in more grant money, create a global reputation as a leader, get their professorship, get, you know, elected to the board of, be a fellow of something, this, that, or the other, or rise through whatever ranks it is, doing what their dean or whoever has told them to do about sharing research data or putting information into a CRIS system really is very, very secondary to them, and they don't really care. And if they don't do it, they don't particularly face any consequences. So it's no good to simply go to, or it's not enough to simply go to the research administration office or whatever it happens to be and explain to them the benefits of if all of everybody did this or that or the other, it would be very beneficial. You have to sell it to those individual researchers as well. And so now we have a problem that in the past, every single institutional information system that anyone has ever introduced has increased the amount of administrative burden on researchers. That's a very strong statement, but frankly, I think it's true. And so how do we turn that corner? How do we convince, how do we create that sort of bottom-up grassroots effect, if you like, of getting professors to buy into these systems and to do these things? Because currently, they don't see it as helping them. They see it as helping somebody else. So I don't know what the panel thinks about that as a perspective, and you know, and as a way forward. How do we turn that corner?
Rory, is that your comment related to that?
Yes, it is. Hi. So yes, I second everything that Phil said. So I think one idea is to make the tools that are designed research data management tools, if you will, things like data management plans and repositories that the institution is encouraging researchers to adopt, make those tools interoperable with other tools that researchers actually want to use and are already using. That's step one. And then step two is make it seamless for those to interoperate. So then, first of all, the researcher is doing it as part of their natural workflow that they're already that they've already adopted, and secondly, it's easy for them to do it. So I think, to me, that has to be a starting point for increasing adoption.
Okay, thanks, Rory. Yeah.
Hey, Rory.
Hey, Phil.
Steve, you also put up your hand?
Yeah, so thanks, Phil. That's I think struck home in many ways, all the points you're raising there. And I think we've sort of struck this problem, and I mean, I think I wrote that second statement question about the culture to do with the community to practice stuff, and I was addressing the operational concerns, not the researcher concerns in that particular part. But one thing that we formed, and Keith knows, because it sort of became the business case and basis for one of the large programs that his organisation now funds. The big universities in Australia got together and asked that very same question and sort of realized that there are certain things that we need to address at both the culture of researchers, but also the culture within organizations. And one of the things that we noticed, or we sort of, we've kind of realized, is that a lot of these systems, proliferation of these systems that we're asking researchers to, add information to. Yeah, they're great for someone who's got a, administrative job trying to keep compliance or get performance measure, whatever. But they're not crafted to be friendly and a part of the research practice itself. And so one of the things that we've done is we've realized, hey, if we change the way we give that storage in for example, James's RDSS, but we made it so that every year there is a health check, basically the application gets renewed or something. There's some reason why we touch them every year. We can use that opportunity to ask for a little bit more information. And so we don't expect to have all of the metadata from day one, but we look at ways where every single time they engage with us, we try and get some more of it. And so we've been looking at things like, well, can we feed into some of the validations that we're trying to do with the research administration system when someone asks for more storage, for example, things along those lines. We've been entertaining things along those lines. So there's things like that we've been doing, which I think are kind of interesting. I don't have any data to help anyone with it, but that's the sort of approach that we've sort of taken. We're not expecting any one system to solve the problem, but it's a much more of a, how do we change the way we use these systems and our expectations around them such that they fit into research practice itself and then endear people along. And actually, I might say one last thing before I go is, and there's another project that we're involved with, which is taking something like 100 national significant collections that we have, and they're notionally within the university, within Monash University. And what we're doing is, that was always given as a storage thing, but what we're doing now is we're going through for all of those national collections, and we're saying, well, do you even have a DOI, right? Do you actually have it as something that is basically fair or open in some ways? And we all thought that when we engaged the almost towards 1,000 CIs involved in this thing, we all thought that they would not want to be part of that conversation. But what we discovered is if we can get a piece of information out of them in that engagement, they all actually want the benefit of a DOI. They just haven't done it before. So it's I think just always about trying to make it an incremental step. Every time we engage with them, you just get a little piece of extra information, and we add that to the metadata that we have. That seems to be a way that is more compliant to research practice and expectations. And what we're finding is we're getting champions. People who actually want to do it, which is surprising. Anyway, I'll leave it at that.
Thanks, Steve. And I'd like to come back to the culture piece in a second. But Kimmy, you had your hand raised.
Yeah, I just thought of something that came up in a project implementation committee, which is at quite an executive level, is that we must really stop telling the researchers that we're necessarily going to save them time, because a lot of time it is an admin burden that we're giving the researchers. And not just looking at what's in it for them, but that's exactly what they want. And in this context with interoperability, one of the main gifts that we're giving researchers and the universities in general is the ability for reporting. Because if you've got your data all right, you'd be able to do very complex reports that you could never, ever, ever do before. And we have a post-awards process in our Lifecycle where funder reporting, but also internal reporting. You can see who's getting funding, where help is needed, all sorts of things. So what we've tried to do is on the what's in it for me, for the researchers, is not say, look, it's going to save you time, because a lot of the time they weren't even using these systems, so it is actually more of a burden to them. But we're going to say, look, instead of running around for 3 days trying to find manual input to put in a report because it's needed by a funder or it's needed by the university, or you need to motivate for more funding or something else, because you've done all this groundwork, you can get X, Y, Z reports at a click of a button. And that's what we are trying at the moment.
Okay, great. Thanks, Kimmy. So one point that's come up here, and we've already talked a bit about the difference in culture between the researchers and the administrative layer in the university. I thought this was also really interesting that somebody wrote a comment here which I really find quite interesting, and that's around each unit of the university is attempting to optimize their function role. So not only the researchers have their own targets and their own are trying to optimize their function and role, but also different organizational units like a research office and a library and IT, they're all trying to optimize their function and role. So hence, for any of those units to lead in their field, they need independence. So I'm intrigued who wrote that, and if you'd like to elaborate a little bit on that, because I think there's also questions about the culture differences between different units and maybe even administrative units within the university.
I think I'm going to disappoint you, Keith, and say it was me.
Oh. Okay, do you want to talk about that, Steve?
Yes, so it's true, right? And it's been, people have been saying that today, is that the various groups are interested in what they're going to do, and they do what they do, and if you try and champion the idea of interoperability, each of those stakeholders are just interested in the bits that they're being paid for, right? There's an administrator that's paid to optimize something. There's one that's paid to ensure compliance, whatever, and they're going to just run the systems they need to run, right? One of the things that we've done, or what I have been trying to do is, and we've been running for a long time, is, and I'm interested in I'll ask a question, I'm interested in the response, is what we noticed was the people on the ground tend to want to make this happen. It's just that the big bosses are the ones that don't want to fund it. And so I've been establishing these, I guess, working groups you call them, but where these various pillars, and the longest standing one is around research data, and it's got the archival people, the retention people, the library people, the storage people, the research people, the sensitive data people. They're all rock up in this fortnightly forum that's been running for 8 years, I think now, from when it first started. And one of the things that we've done is try to make that collection of practitioners, these are administrators, not researchers, speak the same language. So for every challenge they have, everything that's coming up, it's like, can we get all those groups at least to speak about it the same way? And then through that, not only do all the groups sort of end up understanding each other and actually liking each other, they're also able to pick apart the problems in a more useful way. We do make a rule that says no one group can tell another group what to do, that sort of thing. So the decisions can't be made there, but they can certainly discuss things and provide recommendations and things, which has been really, really useful at trying to break down that cultural barrier and sort of leading to much more of a communities of practice thing. What we don't have is an established, agreed metadata standard that's for interoperable. It's like the last thing anyone wants. It's sort of not needed if you can get people working together anyway. But that's just the view that we have, and I'll be interested to see if anyone has any sort of similar experiences.
Yeah, James?
Yeah, I think that's a really sort of pertinent point, particularly at very large organizations, is that each part of the administrative group, they all have their own local objectives that have been set for them and what they need to do, and just getting the time and space to have those kind of high level community of practice kind of meetings, I think is really important. We're starting now to try and work a bit more like that at UCL, but I think it has been the case in the past that your motivations aren't necessarily completely joined up across even the administrative part of the university, not least the academic researchers themselves. And I think it's a very pertinent point to raise. Have you noticed kind of much improvements or anything, Stephen, the work you've been doing with universities and getting that to happen? Have you seen a real impact?
Yeah, there is there's this amazing story, I think, where we now have a thing that we call, so you're just for entertainment's sake, that group, that one I'm talking about, is called the Morgue. It's called the Monash Agent Working Group. There's a reason why it was called that, but it was like, but when it first came up, it was like, I can't say that. People are going to think it's shocking. And what we discovered was everyone went, what's the Morgue? That's really interesting. And they want to know more, right? When we got the archivists involved, or the retention people, one or two, they're kind of the same group, but they started to introduce the idea of sentencing. So when we have a data collection, do we have a notional date by which we will review, its end of life or something? It's sentencing. So it's not about what day it gets deleted, it's about what day you have the conversation next, and that sort of process. And we ended up there because those administrators who are used to destroying student records and thinking of lots of simple data, and they had lots of it, but really just a few cases of it. What they soon discovered is every practice they have doesn't scale for that independence, as our other colleague mentioned, of researchers. Phil mentioned that they're all independent businesses, 1,000, 2,000 independent businesses. The process didn't scale, right? And so they realized they could meet the same disposal requirements, compliance requirements, by using the sentencing idea. It works. And then we implemented a system that's called MURDA, the Monash University Research Data Archive. So all the murder sentencing morgue, as an outcome. So, and that only happened because they gave themselves the chance to talk about it the same way. And it first went through the pain of being overly student record before they realized actually that doesn't work, and a big group of people agreed all at once. So it was, yeah.
Okay, thanks Steve. So Rory, I'm not sure if you still have your hand up or whether you've put it up again. The problem is the system doesn't take your hand down, I think. So yep. Is there something?
Sorry, I put it down. Yeah.
Oh, okay. Okay, good. I was sorry. I was worried that I'd left you with your hand raised for a long time. So thanks. Okay. Thank you. So I find it really interesting to look at these different challenges. And as we were preparing for this session, I was intrigued to see what sort of responses we'd get. And I was wondering about technical questions, maybe metadata standards, the lack of a metadata standard across that would allow for this interoperability. And looking at the responses we've got here, there's very little in the technical space, and most of the comments do relate to culture and the difference in culture and the different drivers for researchers and organizational units in the university and bringing that together. And so I find it a really interesting picture across all of your responses. That appears to be the emphasis appears to be quite strongly on people in this as a part of this puzzle. Okay, Phil, if I'll hand over to you, and then I'll after that I'll hand back to James to wrap up. So, Phil, go ahead.
Yeah, so I wanted to. That made me think of something, a piece of work that we have recently done on and I can't talk about it in any specifics, but it was a national level piece of research for a particular country, and it was looking at the ability to aggregate metadata from repositories from across that country. And we found that it was impossible to ask certain very simple questions. For example, how many authors have ORCID IDs, or how many contributors to a piece of research have an ORCID ID on it, for the majority of the repositories in that institution. So looking at the common data standards like Dublin Core with OpenAIRE guidelines applied to it, trying to look through that lens to aggregate that metadata, we found that was impossible. So to what degree do we have a real problem with a lack of metadata standards and a lack of perhaps API standards as well, that is causing it to be incredibly difficult to do these interactions, to make these systems sort of interoperable, both within institutions and across institutions, which is of course what's important to funders and to governments and so forth.
Thanks, Phil. Yeah, so indeed, is it the metadata, or is it the organizations and the people?
Yeah, I think that's quite interesting. When we started this, I was kind of hoping that other people would just have solutions to all our metadata woes and so forth. It was a bit of a forlorn hope, and I kind of expected it would be to from the word go, really. But yes, it's a question of, are we not talking about metadata solutions because we all know they're there? Therefore, we talk about culture and what we can do for cultural change, because there is an area where we can potentially have an impact. It'd be quite hard for any single one of us to come along and address every single issue with metadata standards between different tools when they're not within our sort of control. But it was very interesting. I mean, I agree with Keith, the amount of conversations, and certainly the ones I've been agreeing with, the ideas that have been appearing about culture change, I think would take us an awfully long way towards a better thing. And also Phil's point earlier, I'm sorry, I've been dropping in and out of this because I've had various internet problems over the last hour, but certainly Phil's point about needing to kind of do things that actually align with the way researchers work, because it's very hard to persuade researchers to look up from their research and engage in kind of data management activities when they don't get an immediate benefit from it. And I think that's still a question that it's one of these things that everybody knows, but it is hard to address. So it's really good to hear some ideas being brought forward about, you know, how we can do that. And thanks Rory in particular for your suggestion. Obviously, as an institution that's just adopting our space, which Rory works for, hopefully, you know, we can use those kind of tools that researchers want to use to try and get a bit more interoperability, and we're looking forward to working on that. So thank you for everyone for that. Well, at least the bits I've managed to catch have been extremely interesting and very useful. So I'd like to thank everyone. So just to wrap up, I think it's been a really interesting conversation. If you have time to go back and add more of these kind of things about the challenges and upvote things and so forth, please do. I think it'll be quite useful, because between these plenary meetings, we kind of go away and try and get groups of people together to discuss where we want to move the focus, what we want to look at next. And at one of these days, we're going to, you know, actually form a working group on something and try and produce things. Generally, this session tends to be a place where people come together and sort of exchange woes and information and ideas and so forth. But if we can produce a working group at some point, that sort of fit the this research data alliance kind of way of doing things. But I think it will be very interesting after this meeting for us to go away, look at these issues, where the thumbs up have been, and maybe seek through those to try and find some good themes to pick up that we can work on in future. Obviously, the nature of the group tends to be quite technical, but we can bring in these kind of cultural elements and so forth as well. So that's the first observation. The second is my traditional plea at the end of all of these meetings. We are quite a popular, I think, interest group in RDA, and we tend to have plenty of people joining us. Thank you very much for joining us today. I hope you've enjoyed the conversations. But we only have the two co-chairs, that's me and Keith. As you can see, we're not a particularly diverse pair. There are lots of people who get involved between these meetings, but it would be great to have another co-chair. You don't have to be diverse, but that would be particularly welcome. Do come and sort of and join us, and we can maybe share the organizational burden a little bit and just have a chat with Keith or me afterwards if you are interested in getting a bit more involved in the group. And we will be in touch. If you're not signed up to the Ardari group, please sign up so you'll get our sort of meeting invitations between meetings. We know everyone's busy. A lot of us have sort of jobs in universities and so forth, and finding time away from the dojo is always a bit of a challenge. But we'll let you know when we're going to be having meetings, of planning future sessions and stuff. Do join us, do get more involved, and I hope it's been a useful and informative session this morning. Don't know if you've got anything else to add to that, Keith?
No, thank you. Look, indeed, we are looking for a co-chair, so please, if you're interested, please approach us and please get in touch. Happy to talk about what it means and the opportunities that it provides. So, yes. Well, in that case, I'd like to thank you, Kimmy, for your presentation. That was great.
Yeah, thanks,
and
Kimmy. That was
thank
really
you
good.
all for all your contributions. It was really interesting and a very rich collection of perspectives. So thank you very much. And I hope you have a lovely remainder of the plenary.
Thanks, everyone. Bye.
Thank you all.
Thanks, everyone. Goodbye.
Thank you.